Welcome to Total Money Management. We're back with a bit of a different one. So you're listening to this on likely the Friday. The next episode will be released on Tuesday, and we thought it'd be a good little tied-over episode. I'm obviously back with Steve on the new normal. Now, the new normal is something that Steve created, came up with, whatever you want to call it, and we made a special podcast episode. I think it's episode 12. Right. And it was around November 2023. And we're covering topics that we're talking about now that we actually covered then, almost predicting things that were happening. We thought it'd be a really good idea to, given the volatility, given Trump's tariffs and everything that's happening in the world at the moment, to just quickly highlight each one of those 10 new normal points for 10 or 15 minutes. And then what's going to happen is we're going to cut back to the actual new normal episode, which I think for you guys that are listening that are relatively new in the last 6 months or so, since it started to take off a bit, wouldn't have come across. So did you want to do a brief intro to what the new normal is? Bit of a thesis?
The idea is, as we've sort of spoken about, the world is changing and it's been pretty smooth sailing generally for about the last 40, 45 years. Right, changes really started kicking in 75, 80. Basically, I think it was Thatcher in 78 and Reagan in 80, and in Australia, Hawke and Keating, right, in I think it was 82. That was when we went from being sort of fairly insular, highly regulated, to going back to globalisation, right, the globalisation Mark II, right? And so there were a couple of issues there. There were four major issues. We call them the 4 Cs: COVID, conflict, children, which is a bit of a cheat for demographics, and climate change. And what we were saying was they're the big umbrella issues, but there's 10 issues we highlighted underneath to say this is where we're going from and this is where we're going to.
Exactly, yeah. So the first one of those was from global to local.
Yep.
And it's something that's actually quite prevalent in what we've been talking about the last few months, but
absolutely.
Give us an update on that.
Well, the idea was the last 40 years was globalisation. I want to buy Polish fish. It's like, no problem, jump online and you can do that, right? Yep. As I think we said last week or so, globalisation's dead, right? It is well and truly over. What we're doing now is we're just sorting out how we de-globalise without causing ourselves, and I talk about that in country terms, of too much pain, right? So how do I now reduce my reliance on China and bring the back stuff locally, right? And that's probably the biggest issue, because China so dominates manufacturing that we don't realise how integrated supply chains are. They are unbelievably complex. And again, this is what we found out with COVID, where everybody went, what do you mean there's 120 suppliers? And it's like, that's what it's like now, right? And so that's where the shock has come. And I think since we talked about this roughly 18, 16 months ago.
Yeah, November.
I think, I'm sorry, I'm going to give myself a big tick for that one, right? Because I think we're on the money.
Well, funnily enough, you were talking about that point when we first met. Probably it'll be almost 10 years ago. 8 years ago now. So, you've done well. The second one was private markets to public government, which we're seeing a bit.
Yeah, what I was highlighting there was that private markets have been the dominant theme again for the last 40 years, right? What you're seeing now is, and we're seeing this in Australia, we're seeing it in England at the moment with the UK government talking about nationalising British steel. Albo stepped in to save some steel works here. What you're seeing now is this is where markets and politics clash, right? All capitalists say to the government, get out of the way, right? The government is there to regulate them, and the arm wrestle is a constant thing about too much regulation, too much market. Well, we've had 40 years, 45 years of really free markets, or generally pretty free markets, free trade, all that sort of stuff. So that's now changing to where the government is now having much more influence and much more say about industry policy. So, for example, what you're seeing with Donald Trump, what you saw previously with Joe Biden, with the CHIPS Act, saying, we want semiconductors, right? And the private markets are like, dude, we're not building them there. It's too expensive. Here's $50 billion. Okay, we're coming. So that's the government saying, we want something, we're prepared to pay to get it back now, right? Whereas before it would have been like, no, we can't compete, so therefore we don't do that.
Yeah, they had a backseat, more of a backseat.
Yeah. And that's because there's a whole raft of issues with climate change. Again, COVID was where people went, oh, I didn't know we get everything from China. It's like, yep, that's why we haven't got anything now.
Or it was, we know we get it from China, but we didn't actually know the impacts of that.
Yeah. Well, we didn't realise how fragile our economies could be, right, because of a pandemic.
Yeah. You go through these 18 months ago in the episode, just to go back in time. So you'll go more in depth on a younger Steve. So the next one is monetary to fiscal policy.
Okay. In the monetary policy is basically interest rates, okay? Low interest rates and private debt, right?
Yep.
Get people to borrow, right? Interest rates are low, and it's the public sector sort of stuff. Interest rates are really important. They're everything, right? Fiscal policy is government.
Yep.
We tax money and we tax you and we spend it, right? So they're two separate things. For the last 40 years, as you've seen, bond yields have come from 20% to, during COVID, zero.
Yeah, zero.
Right? So that was monetary policy. Everybody talks about the Reserve Bank. Everybody talks about the Fed. Right, the New York Fed, American Fed. Now fiscal policy is coming back into vogue because governments were out of the picture, so the reliance was on you borrowing, not the government going into deficit. Well, that changed with Biden and again with COVID where they went, dude, we got to spend a lot of money, right? So nobody said, no, let's just cut interest rates. They did that as well, but what they realised was that wasn't going to save the joint.
It wasn't enough. Yeah.
Right? So fiscal policy is now completely dominant. There's a thing now going around, and it's been going around for a few months now, called fiscal dominance, which is, as I said there, that's where you go from who cares about interest rates, the government's spending a lot of money, and that, whoever spends the money gets the say. And so, again, that ties in with, the government saying, we're spending a lot of money, and listen, you guys, we're telling you what we want.
Yeah, we're in charge.
Right?
Yeah.
We're not going to leave it to the market anymore. We actually want to build semiconductors here. Right?
For other reasons.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, national security reasons.
Exactly. Right? From just in time to just in case.
Yep. Manufacturing. Just in time was it was an American invention, but it was exploited by the Japanese in manufacturing, right? So the idea was you don't have a lot of inventory. You just, you get it to the factory just in time, right, to be built. That was really great, really, really great. But the problem was, again, in COVID, when they went, dude, we need lots of masks. It's like, no, we manufacture them just in time now. So in other words, no, we need 1 million masks. It's like, well, you're going to have to wait for us to do them.
To make them.
Now what we're flipping to is just in case. So in other words, economic efficiency gives way to emergency supplies where government says, listen, well, let me give you a great example at the moment, right? China exports rare earths, right? And everybody's relying on China because it processes them, right? China in 2011 says to the Japanese, we're not going to give you rare earths, right, because they're having a blue. Okay. Now, China last week said to Donald Trump, we're not exporting rare earths again, right? The Americans went, oh, man, we haven't got any, right? They haven't stockpiled. The Japanese have got understood to have about 12 months supply, right? That's why they're smart. But what they're doing is saying, we're going to have, we're going to have $1 billion worth of rare earths sitting there. And it's like, yeah, I know, but they're there.
Just
right?
in case.
The Americans went, oh, we don't want to tie up all that money, right? And now they're going, man, we got to get some rare earths, right? That's why I'm saying what you'll see is you'll see emergency supplies everywhere, right? Food, and so we'll have less economic efficiency and more slack in the system. Why? Just in case, right? Just in case we get a global pandemic. Just in case China says we're not going to send you stuff, right? So that's what's going on.
Okay, makes sense. Soft assets to hard assets.
Just from, basically that could be from software to hardware, right? So we've all talked about services, right? And, Facebook and, Instagram and all those things. Now we're going to go back to hard assets. So,
okay, like building railways and
resources, right?
Yeah.
So again, it will be, listen, mate, we don't care about Facebook. We want iron ore.
And that's where the funding's going to go, you mean?
That's exactly right.
Okay, it makes sense.
Right?
Yeah. All right.
That's a big one,
Yeah.
right? Because soft assets have been where a lot of the money has gone, right? And now what you do is you think of it. If you build a factory, it ties up resources for 20 years, right? It's not just, flipping companies and stuff like that. It's like, listen, we're in this for 25 to 30 to 40 to 50 years. So it's a long asset to hold, right? Whereas Facebook's like, 3 computers and a guy, right?
I'm sure that's what it is.
There's probably a little bit more.
But I get your point.
Yeah, there's probably a little bit more to it.
Well, that ties in from money to materials, I guess, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. See, Wall Street, we run the world. Not anymore, sport. The commodity traders are the ones that run the world now because everybody wants to get their hands on oil, iron ore, rare earths, agriculture, right? Because now we're not friends.
Yeah. God, everything's just supply and demand, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Deflation's inflation.
Yep.
Which we're seeing.
It's pretty, inflation during COVID, deflation during COVID and raging inflation since. It's calming down a little bit more, but longer term, we're not going back to zero inflation. We may if there's a disaster somewhere, but generally, inflation is going to come from higher wages because, again, like the 4 Cs, there's less kids, there's, we need people to build stuff. Right, and so wages will have to go up to attract people to do some stuff, right? Particularly if it's manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
Yes, there's robotics, I get all that, but you still need people to do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and it's got to be more lucrative because people think they can do anything nowadays.
Well, I'll be old, Bane, and I'll be in the nursing home, right? So they'll be paying blokes like you a lot more than they will me because you'll be a producer.
Yeah.
Right, we need you to make stuff, dude. What for? Because Steve's in there dribbling in the nursing home, right? So that's the way it is.
Mate, I'll come visit you, I promise. Capital gain to income. This is an interesting one. So this is more talking about dividends coming in from slower moving equities, I guess.
Yeah, if I can put it in property terms as a sort of pretty good metaphor, everybody at the moment in property in the last 20 or 30 years has talked about property flipping and making the big money from the capital gain.
Yeah.
Right? We're moving to a place where there won't be a big capital gain, but there'll be income.
Like yield.
And so that's where the yield will become really important because if you're not getting a capital gain, what you have to say is, well, hopefully I'll be getting at least a decent income from it. Right? And that's what I'm trying to say there, that the era of speculate, like really mad speculation, cryptocurrencies, they, 1 minute they're $20, next minute they're 20,000.
Yeah.
Right? That will probably peter out.
Taper off, yeah.
And will become more about buying a residential property for the 10% yield. Right?
Yeah.
Not the $500,000, I'm going to flip this sucker in 3 years.
Yeah. That's going to taper off as well.
Absolutely.
Debt to equity. Number 9.
Yeah, well, again, it's been really lucrative for the last 30 to 40 years to borrow debt, right? Go into debt and, again, flip it, the capital gain stuff. We're moving more now into having equity, right? Which again, what we're doing is we're lengthening the process, right? So as I said to you before, when we go from soft assets to hard assets, when you build a factory, you don't go, oh yeah, we'll be turning this sucker over in 3 years. It's like, dude, it's there for 50.
Yeah, we're not going to demolish this in a couple of years.
That's right. You know, you're not going to be coming back every year going, hey, we're going to use the factory as collateral and we're going to, speculate in the, the CDO market, right? That all of that'll go by the wayside and it'll be all back on churning out, semiconductors for cars and robotics and
getting people employed, which will increase inflation.
Yep. And that leads to the last one.
From consumption to production.
Yep. So predominantly the last 40 years has been about consumption, right? Not production. And what I mean by that is the consumer has been king, right? We're moving now back into a producer economy. And what I mean by that is you will get more emphasis again on the worker because they're going to be the important part now, right? So the other thing is too, if I say to you, Jacob, we're not buying any of that stuff from China, the emphasis becomes on a producer, right? Second part is when the government says, right, we're going to spend a lot of money building a lot of factories, when GDP is about 70% consumption, right? What happens is consumption falls and investment rises. So investment becomes more a percentage of GDP.
Right.
Okay, it's a little bit technical. We'll go into it further, but what essentially what I'm saying is we're going back to what it was like in the 70s and the 60s, which was you'll have a steady job, you'll get good wages, you won't feel the desire to speculate like crazy because you'll have your future will be on a more solid footing, right? You'll be praised a little bit because you're hey, this dude's a producer, right? I'm a consumer because I'm old, right? So I'm consuming resources, right? It'll be guys like you and probably your kids that will be really important because they'll be the gold mine that, hey, this is a kid that builds stuff. We really need to get him. Why? Because Steve's, dribbling in the nursing home. He's consuming stuff. So that's where it's going to swing over to who cares what the consumer wants. The fact is we've got to build stuff.
To a production economy.
Well, look at resi property, right?
Yeah.
We're all gagging for tradies and, they can earn $300,000 a year. Why? Because people want houses, right? Production. We need production, not consumption.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, well, that's the highlight. Now we'll have the 2023 new normal podcast start, so stay tuned. Other than that, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Cheers, folks.
Happy Easter. Back to Three Amigos with Tom Hill and Steve Moriarty. This time around, we're going to be talking about the new normal, more specifically children, COVID, conflict, and climate. Today's episode, we'll be talking about deglobalization, reglobalization, and going from global to local. So on that note, I might pass over to Mr. Moriarty.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good to be back. Look, just to give the listeners a brief overview of what we're trying to do here, the period that we're in at the moment is in a sort of state of what I call a state of flux. So we've had this paradigm for the last 30 or 40 years, probably from the late 70s, mainly in the early 80s with the, the election of Margaret Thatcher in England and Ronald Reagan in the United States. And so they brought in all these new reforms because they had to deal with the post-war economy from 1945, which had run for 30 to 35 years, but then hit, as all sort of economic theories do, it started to stagnate, right? And so what they did was said, we'll just apply more of the same. And that didn't work. And eventually you get to the point where you go, we need to try something different here. And that's when Thatcher and Reagan came in and said, righto, there's less government, there's more liberalisation, we need to focus on finance more. And all of these reforms that brought in a new economy, and this is the big picture, that's now run for about 40 years. And so what we're saying now is that's reached its natural sort of problems, which is, well, interest rates were so low, they didn't, you couldn't cut them any further. Wage rates are so low, they couldn't go any lower. There's so much debt, there's nobody left to borrow. And so we're at that same pivot point where we were 40 years ago of saying, well, we need some new answers rather than just relying on the old one. Mm-hmm. And the thing we're getting out of that, well, the big impact we're going to talk about is the deglobalization from globalization in the current paradigm, and also what we talked about was the 4 Cs: COVID, conflict, children, and climate change, because they're going to be the major drivers globally of introducing a new system. And even if I just sort of say, you think about climate change and the revolution that's coming to production and consumption, right? That alone, that's not, and our argument is that's not resolvable by saying, oh, well, we'll just let the market price goods, and hey, if you haven't got any money, well, bad luck, you don't get to participate in the economy. That's no longer viable.
So the underlying message here then, the last 40 years, the way we've made our, investment decisions, it's been an unbelievable period for capital growth, which I'm sure your generation has benefited from quite nicely, Steve. Must be very nice.
Must be nice.
Must be very nice.
Hey, sometimes you just get born lucky, okay?
So what you're kind of saying here is, look, these are the major drivers why we think the way we make our investment decisions are going to have to be different over the next 30, 40 years. And we can't just rely on that, that last solid period to inform future decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. That's the main point we're going to sort of flesh out. But it's really important because generally what we do is when we look at data, the argument always is, well, is 10 years, 20 years or 100 years, which data is relevant to use now? And if we said, oh, well, let's use the last 20 years since 2000, that what we're saying is that's the old normal, right? And you can't now apply that. So in a sense, it'd be a little bit like saying, you just buy the dip, right? And because every time you've bought the dip, it's come back up.
Yeah.
And so what we're sort of saying now is, be aware that buying the dip may no longer work because you're working in a different world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go back a couple of steps and throw a curvy question in there. You mentioned Maggie Thatcher from way back, which to me, and growing up in the north of England, is a bit of a dirty word, Margaret Thatcher, because I think all of my family lost their jobs in the coal mine.
I was going to say, yeah, there you go.
So, but I just wanted to, now I've actually had more than an emotional response of thinking about it. Why did Maggie Thatcher decide to do that? Outsourcing, lower costs?
There was a couple of reasons. One was, yes, the ideological reason Thatcher did that, because as a Conservative, she wanted to basically smash the unions. Now, and this is the difference. In the 70s, unions and 60s, the unions had great power, right? Because they would collectively bargain wage rises. And so capital, the business owner, was basically always struggled, because if inflation was at 5%, which at 5 and 6%, which was quite normal, right? The business owners were like, well, I had to keep putting up the prices, and that was, that reduces profit. So if you think about, if you make a cup of coffee, there's an embedded cost of labour in that coffee. And then there's the cost of the materials, blah, blah, blah. And what's left over is yours as the business owner, right? Well, if the labour costs keep rising and you're unable to keep putting up the prices, then your profit margin is being squeezed, right? Now, these days you can say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of Jacob on $32 an hour, and I'm going to employ Tom on $18 an hour. All they got to do is make coffee, right? So that gap is then your profit margin. But if I come along and say, no, wait, dude, you can't sack Jacob because he's part of the union. And, if you sack Jacob, we're all going on strike and you're all going to start losing money. Your natural response is, or the owner's response is, Jesus, I'd love to give these unions a bullet. And that's what Thatcher was doing. Thatcher was breaking down the unions because the coal mines in Britain were inefficient. Right, and it was cheaper to import it from Australia or China or wherever.
Yeah, okay.
Right, and that favoured capital, right, i.e. the business owners.
Oh, huge economic growth.
Absolutely,
after that period.
Absolutely, and so that's now what you've seen lately, the last 12, 18 months, the unions are starting to expand again. Right, the United Auto Workers in the United States, they're starting to play up again. Right, and it's not about a judgment. It's simply saying the power is shifting, and this is one of the things we're going to talk about with children, right? The power is shifting back to the employee because there's labour shortages.
Well, what I'm noticing is, on the conflict point, we're relying too much on import from countries such as Russia, China.
Absolutely.
And we're not fucking getting along with them. So
Well,
they're pressing the stop button.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole point with the conflict, right? And COVID, what we did was we went, Jesus Christ, we're relying on the Chinese for all these masks. And if they go, well, no, we're not sending it to you, well, what are we going to do about it? We can't just go, oh, well, that's all right, we'll just knock up a factory and make them ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? And that's been a trigger. How many, just an example for demographics, how many siblings have you got?
Yeah, I've one sister.
Right.
Yeah, I got 2, 3 of us.
Yeah. See, I got 4. But I'm 60, you guys are 29 or 30.
Yeah.
So I'm old enough to be your father. But my point being, we had lots of, there were lots of people my age.
Rabbits back in the day.
Absolutely. There was, it was for a good cause, Jacob. But by the same token, the governments promoted that, right? Because we had child endowment policy. So the more children you had, the government would send you money. And they did that because we wiped out a few million in the war, right? World War II. So we had to sort of repopulate. And so that was what was going on. But we now, just the three of us are a microcosm of the macro position, which is there's now going to be, we can plot the chart and go, God, Jesus, there's going to be a lot of old people like Steve, and there's not going to be enough young people like Tom and Jacob, first of all, to look after Steve and all his old cronies. And secondly, these guys are not having enough kids to continue the population rise.
Because everything's too expensive to pop a baby out now.
But that, you see what I mean? Yeah. That's exactly right. Whereas in my day, my father, there was government subsidies, there was all this stuff. The wages were quite good. Yeah, there was inflation, but the wages were good. Job security was like, even for me, I left school at 15 and basically walked into a job. Whereas the guys now, and even you guys 15 years ago, it wasn't like, oh, well, I'll just pop in and, get a job somewhere and build a career. It's a lot harder. And so, as you say, you look at it and go, oh, Jesus, how can I have a couple of kids if I haven't got a steady wage? I don't know what's going on in, the economy. I can get sacked at the blink of an eye.
Everything's going up. Yeah.
100%.
Well, I look around. Interesting point. Obviously, I've got 2 kids. Jacob, obviously, none yet that we know of. But
he will after the show.
If I look around, it's more and more common. Most people are having like 1 or 2.
Exactly.
It's pretty rare to see, people with 3 or 4. And I don't know anyone with 5.
Yep. And that's what I...
Probably a bit smarter now, actually.
Who you are.
Yeah.
Well, but you see what I mean? Like, these things reach tipping points, and that's why, we're sort of saying COVID, conflict, climate and children are all of these really big issues that change the way that investors need to think about the world going forward, right? So if I can use the broadest sort of argument, it's like saying, yeah, just buy technology, right? Because it boom and it's a growth area and blah, blah, blah. No, not anymore. You're going to make more money in oil and basic materials and commodities over the next probably 10 or 15 years rather than buying, Zoom software or, a package, right? And the reason why is simple, because the world's changing, right? We're no longer, as Jacob said, we're not friends with Russia and China anymore. And so from that point of view, you look at it globally and it really changes things. I mean, I related the story to you guys, I think, about my investments in Russia, right? Well, you think about the next 10 years, the last place you'd be thinking about putting money is Russia, right? Because it's hostile. Iran, to a certain extent, China, elements of Africa, elements of Eastern Europe, right? Where these countries are now saying, well, there used to be this one big superpower called the United States, and it basically ran everything. Then China rose and the United States went, hang on, this is not the way we like it to be. And so now, like the old days in the Cold War, there's now a bipolar world where there's America on sort of one side and China/Russia on the other side. And the countries are caught in the middle going, well, which way do I go? I mean, you think about Australia's position, right? Economically, the last 20 years, we've been, I shouldn't say completely, but we've been heavily reliant on China, right? Now, strategically, we've been totally committed to the US alliance, right? Well,
pick a team.
That's exactly right.
Or pick your own and go, you guys figure it out. We're going to start doing things here.
But you get the problem with that is that a lot of these smaller countries, particularly in Asia and stuff, are basically saying, well, we just collateral damage, right, between the US and China because we're too small. Yeah. Right? You think we've got 27 million people. There's not that many of us. And the only thing we've got, I shouldn't say the only thing, but the strong point we've got globally is we've got commodities, right? And if we're going to have these relationships where we no longer buy oil from the Russians, well, that might mean that countries will say, all right, well, listen, what we'll do is we'll convert to gas and we'll buy LNG from Australia, right? But other countries will say, well, we don't like Australia anymore, so we're not buying from Australia. We're going to buy from, our allies. So think of Russia and all of those Russian states, right? They didn't really trade with the outside world, and that's what we're saying with deglobalization, right? Because for the last 40 years, we've all been having a fat time selling stuff to each other and essentially all getting rich.
Yeah, you do that, you do it, you can do it cheaper, all right, than we can do it. So interesting. Because obviously we rely pretty heavily on, we have in the past relied pretty heavily on Russia for a lot of agricultural stuff too, right? Like wheat and that kind of thing. How do you think that's going to impact us?
Well,
if we relate it back to investing.
Yeah. Well, the agriculture, what we were saying before about, the Middle East and Russia, Russia's full of grain and the food bowl, and Ukraine. And in the Middle East, you've got, oil.
Yeah.
And those two areas, prices will, if the Saudis say, well, we're going to reduce oil, right, the oil price rises, right, from one country going, we're going to stop producing so much oil. So that becomes a geopolitical tool for the Saudis to bargain with against the United States, right? So that's where you get inflation because, as you guys know, petrol's what, $2.10, $2.20?
Yeah.
I mean, I know 3 years ago it was about $1.40, right? And I never cared about petrol prices because who cares, But now I'm looking at it going, Jesus, it's $2.15. This is outrageous, right? Because I'm not used to it, right? So whereas 40 years ago it was like, this week petrol's $3. Oh, right, okay, well that's what you got to do, right? Because we were used to inflation. So for investors, you have to look at things like oil and say, okay, there might be a blow up in the oil market, But then you're going to have to say, like we're saying, oh, well, hang on, well, you've got climate change, so then we're going to have to talk about wind power and solar power. Then you're going to have to toggle down and say, okay, well, these oil companies at the moment are providing really good dividends, but they can't get access to capital because the banks are saying, well, if you guys are not going to move to net zero emissions, we're not going to give you money to build new oil wells, right, to explore for new oil wells. We're going to go and favour the guys who want to build solar stations or wind stations, right? There's all of that sort of thing, which, as I say, we haven't had that for the last 40 years. It's just been drill, baby, drill, right? Yeah. And that, you know, America's now a net exporter of energy. Well, that hasn't been the way for the last 40 years. And that changes all the global dynamics.
Interesting. Well, how's it going to affect the everyday Joe Blogs, though?
Well, the prices will. I think we'll get more. I say market volatility, but what I mean is exactly what's going on now, right? You know, look at your coffee. It was all cheaper 12 months ago, 18 months ago, right? It was $4. Now the small ones are $4.50. Well, that's, you know, 12%, 12.5% increase. So what I'm saying is that you look at the 10 years before it, there's no increases like that, right? The big hits, I think, are going to be in things like smartphones, right?
People buying less expensive things.
Well, because, Jacob, we had China sitting there, you know, we probably mentioned this before in saying we need another 1 million smartphones. No worries, here they are, we'll knock them out in a week, right? Because you've got a huge surplus labour there in China that can just pump out stuff like you wouldn't believe, right? And so the last 40 years has been not a shortage of resources, but an abundance of resources, right? And so that's why the prices haven't gone anywhere and we've had huge deflation, right? Because we've been able to say if there's been excess demand, it's been met by this huge excess supply, right? Whereas now, and that's why I'm saying we're going from an era of abundance. There's plenty of labour, there's plenty of capital, there's plenty of resources, to a position now where I'm saying, no, we're running out of materials. Labour is becoming reduced because of demographics and wages are rising. So again, we're going to exactly the opposite sphere.
Yeah, I've got one for you, and I could be barking up the wrong tree, but isn't it just a normal part of the cycle where things start to get more expensive? The economy, we've had a good 20 years, the economy's booming, and now we're bottlenecking and slowing production down. Nobody can afford things anymore. Increase inflation. We're all hermit crabs a little bit for the next 5 years, going to a bear market, and then happy days we go again for 15 years. What's different now than the last time we had a bull into a bear market?
That's what history would suggest if I'm looking at it through, you know, the lens. If I'm, you know, intuitively, I'm going to go, right, the last 20, 30 years, probably a good place to start. Good reference point for me.
Yeah.
Right?
Because that's your experience, Tom, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So completely agree with Jacob's point, you know, and you hear all this stuff like, you see interest rates are rising. That's going to cause all this pressure. We're seeing, you know, increased cost of living, which everyone is feeling it. But general sentiment is, you know, give it a few years, this is going to cool off. Olympics is coming, property will start to boom again. Like, what do you think to that?
Well, that's, again, I think we're being older and having been through not just the sort of standard business cycle, 7-10 years, I've been through what I think and what I'm arguing is a paradigm shift. So in other words, at 60, I was 20 in 1980, right? And even before that, I remember, you know, housing loans were 13.5%, right? And it wasn't like, I'm going to go and bargain for 11. No, dude, it's 13.5%. That's it. Banks closed at 3 o'clock. No, they didn't stay open. No, there was no online stuff. If you didn't get to the bank by 3, well, that's your problem, right? All of that's changed. So, but what you're saying, Tom, is correct, which is your experience has been in the last paradigm. And what I'm saying is, that's relevant, but that's no longer relevant because the paradigm has shifted. And to your argument of, Jacob, your argument about, well, can't we just have a depression and go back to the old ways? And that's why I'm saying no, because the 4 C's have had such a fundamental, having such a fundamental impact globally that everybody is changing. And so if you think through each of those issues, right, including globalisation, you got conflict, right, worldwide. So what's happened there? In the last 2 years, military expenditure has gone through the roof, right? So what does that mean? Well, that means governments are saying, well, we've got to secure the resources to build bombs, right? Okay, what are the resources? Well, we need lots of critical minerals and we need semiconductor chips. Okay, so semiconductor chips, America said to the Chinese, no, you're not getting access to the top stuff now, okay? That really, if you look at it, that's like an act of war, right? If you look at climate, it is useless for Australia to say we're going to meet our net zero and everyone else is out there partying like crazy and polluting the joint, right? We're all breathing the same air. So from that point of view, that's got to be a global solution, right? COVID is continuing to spread and become actually more virulent in some of the strains. And how is that happening? From global travel, right? From people getting on planes and switching countries. Now, that is a global issue. It doesn't matter if Australia says, oh, well, we're going to look after the Sydney to Melbourne leg. It's like, no, dude, you've got to look after the Singapore to Brisbane leg. Yeah. That's where the global people are coming from.
The problem is no one's talking about it anymore either. It's all,
absolutely.
You get COVID, you go home, you just go to sleep for a couple of days and go back out and get on with your day.
That caused enough stress.
Well, you see, what's happened now is we're now getting more and more evidence to show the damage of COVID with long COVID. And another issue just more recently, which gives you a perfect idea, people are having uncontrollable diarrhea on planes. And they're holding the flight because they're, pardon the French, they're shitting themselves, right? And they've had to unload the flights, right? And you know what it's from? It's a result of COVID, right?
Right.
And so what I'm saying is this is what we're getting more and more stuff on COVID by going, they now realise if you've had COVID, you're getting an increase in
the shits.
Well, but also heart problems. Right? The old idea was, it's all right if kids get it, they'll be fine. No, that's not the idea anymore. Right? And so there's all of these problems. Last week there was a judgment where the judge said that Carnival Cruises was responsible for the spreading of COVID on some of its cruise ships. Bang, liability. Right? So now a company says, well, hang on, we're going to be up for $5 million every year because people are going to sue us for COVID. Okay, well, we're going to have to put the prices up, or we're going to have to spend $10 million per ship to, do something about it. So you then move to the other C's, and that's what I mean. Because there's so much interaction, you can't disassemble that without having an enormous change in the underlying structure. Right, that's what I'm saying. These are fundamental changes that the whole world is going through, and you can't solve them by simply saying, "Oh well, we'll cut interest rates." Right? That's not the point.
Like a Band-Aid solution.
Yeah, but it's not even a Band-Aid, Jacob. It's basically saying the Band-Aid. It's no use using a Band-Aid because you really need...
On a gunshot wound.
Yeah, a whole new bandage, and we're going to have to cut your leg off and give you a new one, right? Yeah. It's that big. And the argument is, for the last 40 years, the market will solve it, right? It'll be sorted out through the price mechanism. Whereas now, what I'm saying is, if there is a shortage of resources, both physical and material, then what you have to say is, okay, we need to maximise the efficiency of those resource uses to ensure everybody gets something. Whereas for the past 30 or 40 years, as you guys probably know, you have to rely on your own smarts, right? The government's not there to, to help individuals much, and they haven't for the past 30 or 40 years, right? And so what that means is, well, you're on your own, i.e. the market will resolve it. You can't get a job? Well, go and skill up, right? But I haven't got any money. Well, bad luck. Go and work 3 jobs to get yourself through university. Whereas before it was the government would, as I said, in my era, I can't even remember, but it was just like, yeah, go to this bloke. And I went to that bloke, how are you? Good. Yeah. Start Monday. It's like, okay. And that was it. Whereas, you don't get that these days.
So bringing it back to globalization, deglobalization, I mean, economic theories have all got a lifespan. So that's all changing. What should we expect? What are we going to move to? How can somebody swim through or navigate this next paradigm?
Well, we'll talk about those in future shows. Excuse me. I've listed 10 things there. I think that are big changes out of the 4 Cs. And so that's where I'm trying to guide investors into saying the way that you've invested for the last 30 or 40 years in a low inflation, low interest rate, globalized world is over. Now, you're not going to wake up Monday and go, oh my God, Steve's right. Look at it. The world's completely changed. But what I'm saying is we are trending back to what I'd say, the new normal is the old normal, right? So what I'm saying is those days of saying, oh, well, I can negatively gear a property because interest rates are at 2% and inflation's at, 2%, so it'll be a really good investment because there's going to be a big capital gain. What I'm saying is, no, that's a completely different picture now, buddy, because interest rates are at 6%. And we're already seeing that, right? Interest rates at 6, inflation at 5. The argument 12 months to 2 years ago was, oh, well, that's all right. Interest rates will fall again. Well, now the Federal Reserve is saying, no, higher for longer, right? So that's why I'm saying that's a completely different world where you look at property and say, for example, well, I'm negatively geared property. I'm going to lose money on the rent, but that's okay because I bought it for $1 million and I'm going to sell it for 1.5, right? That's no longer the case because you're now saying, well, hang on, I bought it for $1 million. Instead of losing 200 a week, I'm now losing 600 a week. So I'm going to make at least 600 a week plus expenses plus capital gain. Okay, that sucker's got to go up $50,000 a year for me to make money. That influences your investment allocation decision by saying, well, hang on, that's no longer a great investment. And I think, we were talking before the show, you can get 5% in cash.
Yeah.
Right? Old people like me go, fair, great, I've got a fair bit of money, 5%, that'll cover my cost of living. Why would I take a risk of owning stocks at 60 when I don't really need to? Right? That's what goes on. Institutional investments with a 60-40 bond split or whatever allocation say, well, if I can get 5% safely, why am I risking it for an extra, 1 or 2% in stocks over 10 or 15 years, and inflation's going to eat away all that capital gain?
Yeah. I mean, look, just to kind of like tie this all back, right? The last 30, 40 years, for the most part, and there's been exceptions. We've obviously had enormous crashes, but everything's trended pretty hard. But really, you could get away with buying most things and making money, like fundamentally. Like even if you go back, if you've been a savvy investor through this period, you do extremely well.
Yes.
Like there's still obviously been a lot of opportunities to pick things up that are undervalued, flip them when they're overvalued. But what you're saying is that's going to be more important now than ever. Because
buy and hold has been a great strategy for the most part.
Yeah. Now it's just going to be got to be a bit more strategic with it. Commodities probably where it's going to be worth looking at, where they haven't done a lot. Absolutely.
That's why I say that the world's changing. The next 10 years, or let's fast forward to 2033. I think we're going to be looking back, going, wow, right? Because globalization's declining. As I said, you've got climate change, COVID, conflict, and children, 4 major drivers of economics in the future, right? Rising interest rates, rising inflation, rising wages costs, rising volatility, rising military intervention, right? All of that sort of stuff. We're not going to be doing the same stuff.
Let's start to wrap this up now, gents. I think next week we'll talk about some more really pressing topics that I think will help the listeners a lot. And we'll see you then. Cheers.
Okay.
Awesome.
Cheers, folks.
Thank you.
As always, remember, we don't provide financial advice.